Since we talked about federal spending, we've talked about taxes, now we got to talk about fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy is done by the federal government, all right? Now, if you ever see the term fiscal, that's to do with finances in some way or another, right? In the terms of government, fiscal has to do with the government's finances. Okay, so fiscal policy is the government using two of its biggest powers, taxing and spending, to influence the economy and to stabilize the economy if it is going into recession or if it's going too hot, which can happen also. All right. So taxing and spending here, you remember we talked about that the federal government spends nearly $4.5 trillion per year. It taxes almost $3.5 trillion per year. When we're talking about amounts that big, it can influence how the entire economy operates. So the government can try to use that to influence how the economy operates to its liking. All right. So is going to use this, right? And I'm trying to figure out if I want to do this, right? We talked a little bit about the federal budget last time, right? The process where the president sends something over to Congress and Congress decides what they're actually going to follow it. They pass a budget, which they then send back to the president. All right, and we talk about fiscal year. Fiscal year is not necessarily January to February, or January to December. Lots of times it'll run a different time period during the year, right? Not just for the federal government, but for companies also. They'll have their own fiscal year period. Okay. So, let me see here. Let's go over to this, and I want to try to illustrate what we're talking about here. Let's say the economy is in recession, okay? So if the economy is in recession, what that means is that spending has dropped off, right? Because what happens in recession? Well, consumers start to spend less, businesses invest less, which means that GDP falls, right? So GDP, gross domestic product, the value of everything that we produce in the economy, right, it's decreasing because there's a lot less spending taking place within the economy, which means we're producing less overall. Now, this becomes a problem, right? A recession is going to be when that shrinks for 6 months in a row or more. And in a recession, people lose their jobs, prices tend to go down, which is actually a bad thing, believe it or not. But we wind up having these different issues. So in a recession, what can the government do? Well, the government could come along and engage in expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. And in expansionary fiscal policy, the government will use its taxing and spending to try to fix what is happening in the economy. So in a recession, it equals less spending. Too little spending is taking place. All right. Basically, the economy is going too slow. So what is the government going to do? Well, it's going to try to encourage more spending. Okay. Now, if you might remember that GDP, we had an equation as equal to consumer spending plus business investment plus government spending, plus net exports. All right. Well, what we see is the consumer spending and business spending is going to be too low. Business investment will be too low. We can't suddenly get people to spend more. So what do? Well, the government can control its own spending. It can spend however much money it wants. Remember, it can borrow money. Okay. So in expansionary fiscal policy, what the government will do is come along and will either raise its own spending, that's what the big G is, government spending, and or it will lower taxes. Okay, well, why will it do this? Well, if the government boosts its own spending, then what do people have? Well, the government's going to pay people to do something. It doesn't really matter what. And the guy who first put this forward, John Maynard Keynes, said, well, he could pay people to dig ditches and fill them back in again, right? Or he could pay them to build pyramids, which I like that idea. But whatever it is, you pay them to do something, hopefully something productive like build government buildings or parks or roads or something like that, right? But when you pay people this money, now they have that money in their pocket. What will they do with this money? They'll go and spend it on stuff, right, for themselves. So it'll boost consumer spending. And when businesses now have this money that the consumers spend, the businesses can invest it, right? And now somebody else will have the money and they'll spend some of it, right? So you have this ricochet effect where the government is going to put some money out there and it will bounce around to the economy and create even more economic activity, right? So let's say the government spends $100 billion, right, on stuff, right, for itself or to pay people to do something. Now, people have that $100 billion, all right? They got paid to do something, so $100 billion worth of something got created because the government spent this money. And then people have the $100 billion, they'll spend a chunk of it, they'll save a little bit, but they'll spend a large chunk of it on other things for themselves, which will create even more spending. So let's say they spend $900 million of it. Well, that means that $900 million more stuff got created because of that money. And somebody else has $900 million, so let's say they spend $800 million of that, so there's even more GDP happening, etc., right? So sometimes this is called stimulus spending. They're trying to stimulate the economy into action, right? So you use a little bit of spending in order to create a lot of spending. Sometimes this is called priming the pump of the economy, those old-fashioned pumps, right? You prime that, so you use a little bit of spending in order to get a lot of spending in the economy. All right, so the government will boost its government spending, and then in turn that will eventually boost consumer spending and investment, which then can make GDP go up, okay? And if you lower taxes, it's the same thing. Not as effective, but the same sort of idea. If you lower taxes, that means that people keep more of their money. When people have more money, they will spend more money. All right, so the government can raise government spending and or lower taxes in order to try to boost overall spending in the economy. So that is one option. Now, let's say the economy is going too hot, right? And this sounds weird, but if spending is happening too fast, what occurs is that people are spending, but there's not enough stuff to buy. This is called too much money chasing too few goods. And the end result is inflation, demand pull inflation, because demand is pulling inflation upwards, pulling prices upwards. All right? So if this occurs here, what we need to do in this case is actually slow down the economy. Again, this seems weird, but you're trying to slow down the economy because you're trying to prevent massive inflation from occurring. You're trying to keep a level of spending happening that can be met by our production abilities, our production capabilities. So if the economy is going too fast, what the government will do is contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary. So you do this during times of inflation. Right? Times of inflation because people are trying to spend too much. So in our GDP equation here, right, C plus IG plus G plus XN, right, consumer spending plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports. What's happening is the consumer spending and business investment are too high. Okay? And now the government will come along and it will do the opposite of what it did before. So it will lower government spending and or it will raise taxes. Here the government is trying to get people to spend less. So if the government spends less money, that means it's putting less money out there in the economy, which means people won't have as much money to spend. So that ricochet effect, where the money creates even more production, that won't happen if the government lowers its own spending. At the same time, if it raises taxes, that takes more money away from people, which means they won't have as much money to spend. So the result then would be the government will lower its spending and or raise taxes, which means that investment and consumer spending will both go down, which means GDP will go down as well, or at least will not grow as fast as what it did before. Okay? Now, this is the idea anyway. Does it actually work out this way? Well, this is where you get into some debate, right? So the general idea is you have expansionary fiscal policy, right, which is where you have more government spending and lower taxes. Then you have contractionary fiscal policy, which is where you have less government spending and higher taxes. Okay, well, there are practical considerations involved here, and it's in the PowerPoint here, which I'll post the PowerPoint, you can look at it. But it comes along with the limits of fiscal policy. All right. One of the difficulties here is going to be political pressures, right? Because politicians want to get reelected. It is easy to get reelected, or at least far easier to get reelected if you spend more money because people benefit from that, or if you lower taxes because people like lower taxes. It doesn't work as well the other way around. The idea with the Keynesianism here is that during this time, all right, we're doing the expansionary fiscal policy, is that the government will spend more money while it will tax less. So we'll have more money going out and less money coming in, which means the government will be building up debt in the meantime. Now, if you're a Keynesian, you're going to say, well, this is okay. It's okay to build up debt there because you are going to be able to pay it off over here. Right? When the good times are on, right, and unemployment is really low, the economy is doing well, the government will lower spending while increase taxes. So less money goes out while more money comes in. Right? What do you do with the excess surplus money? Well, you use it to pay off the debt that you built off over here, or built up over there. Now the question though is, does it actually happen this way? Well, this is the practical concerns with it, is that oftentimes, well, no, it does not. Right? Oftentimes what will happen here is that during the bad times, the government will do this, right? During a recession, the government will do stimulus spending. It's already done that several times this year, or at least one big one this year, maybe another time. Right? However, will it lower taxes? And it turns out that a lot of times, no. A lot of times they'll raise taxes, and the reason is because this is going up, right? The government spending is going up. And so they want to tax more in order to pay for it, right? And then over here, during the good times, instead of lowering government spending, it will raise it, right? So that doesn't happen. Reason being is that we're bringing in more money in taxes, so the government wants to spend more money. The politicians want to spend more money. And then during the good times, we tend not to raise taxes. We tend to lower taxes. Why? Well, because we're bringing in so much money in taxes that we're going to lower it so people can keep more of it. So of the four elements, right, this is the only thing that's reliably done, is the government raising government spending in the bad times. So what does this mean? Well, in the bad times we build up debt, and then the good times we build up even more debt, and then it just keeps going, and you get to where we are right now, nearly $27 trillion in debt, with no signs of stopping and no ability really to pay it off. Okay, so going back here, so this is the political pressures, right? We got that right there. The delayed results, this has to do with what's called lag, and which we'll come back to at a different point in time, but it has to do with the effects, right? You got to realize there's a problem, and then you got to decide what to do. You got to decide what the problem is, and then you got to decide what you're going to do, and then you actually have to take action. When you're talking about government and fiscal policy, politicians, it can take a long time. And then you got to see what the actual results are, right? So by the time you actually get to results, it may be far different than the problem that presented itself originally. Okay, it's difficult to predict what's going to wind up happening in the future, right? Things change. This has to do with the timing problem. And it's difficult to get the money out the door, right? Even the federal government has trouble spending a lot of money fast. If you're talking about spending, an extra $1.6 trillion like stimulus spending this year, that's not an easy thing to accomplish, right? Not even the federal government can spend that much extra money easily, okay? So it's got issues here as far as implementation, but that'll be something we'll discuss at a later point in time. Like when we get to monetary policy, we'll come back around and we'll talk a little bit more about this.